Welcome to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. We're here to talk about every high and low, no limits, just good conversation.
Hi everyone. In this episode we discuss suicide and self-harm. Please stop the episode now if you prefer not to listen to this topic.
Welcome everyone to this episode of It's All Mental. It's really great to be here. And I'm really pleased today to be joined by Luke, who I'll introduce to you shortly. Now, as you know, the point of this podcast is for us to talk about, have open and honest conversations about all aspects of mental health, even the ones that are really difficult, even and especially when they're difficult. And today's topic is a painful one because we're here to talk about suicide. Now, I'm conscious if you're listening to this podcast, you might be coming with your own set of experiences. You might have lost someone to suicide. You might be feeling suicidal yourself, or perhaps you have in the past, or you might be worrying about someone who you think might be suicidal and have no idea how to start a conversation with them. So regardless of your experience, this podcast is for you. And I'm just conscious of holding those different perspectives and experiences as we chat today. So we're going to take it gently. So the reason I invited Luke specifically to join us for this podcast is because Luke heads up our mental health first response service at Everyturn Mental Health. So as you might know, if you have a worry about your physical health, you can call NHS 111. What you might not know is that now with 111, there's also the option to get advice about your mental health. So Luke and his team provide that service on behalf of the NHS across several regions in the north of England. And it's a 24-hour service, so Luke and his team have conversations every day with people who, for all sorts of reasons, are really struggling. There are often people who feel like they've reached their crisis point, they feel like they've reached rock bottom, and very often people are feeling suicidal. So Luke is a great person to be here with us today to talk about how on earth you have a conversation about something so painful with someone who's really struggling. So thank you for joining us today, Luke.
No problem. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to dive in with what I think is quite a common worry. So if you're worried about someone, does asking them if they're feeling suicidal put the idea into their head, or does it make it more likely to happen?
No, it doesn't. So I think it's quite where suicide is concerned in the question around asking if someone's suicidal. A lot of people worry about asking that question. And understandably, especially if you're having that conversation with a loved one or a friend, sort of, processing that question and coming to terms with the idea that that person, may be having thoughts that they don't want to be here anymore, it is very difficult and very sensitive. But no, asking that question does not make someone suicidal or more suicidal, more likely, to act on any thoughts that they're having. And actually, evidence has suggested that by sort of having that conversation with someone and asking that question can open up dialogue around, things that they may have been struggling with, things that they don't see a way out of. And the old sort of saying, a problem shared is a problem halved. It starts that conversation around what's going on. So it's a sensitive question. It's a very difficult question sometimes to ask someone. But I would urge people, if they're concerned, to ask the question and just do so openly and honestly. In many cases, someone who's feeling like that may also want someone to ask that question. It's difficult to ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? Are you having thoughts about not being here? But equally, sometimes it can be hard to start that conversation yourself if you're having those thoughts. So by someone else taking ownership and asking that question, for a lot of people anyway, can be somewhat of a relief for someone else to open up that conversation as opposed to them having to do it themselves. And we see that a lot within the mental health first response service.
I think that's really reassuring for people to hear. That's something that I get asked about quite a lot. And there is, I think, that worry that you might be, making someone think about it when they weren't before. Whereas it sounds like actually often the opposite is true and it can be a huge relief. Okay, that's great to know.
Definitely.
So I guess the next question then is how would you notice, how would you know, or what might you notice about someone that might make you think perhaps they're
Yeah.
feeling suicidal?
So mental health is extremely personal. A mental health crisis or mental health distress or, feeling suicidal can look different from kind of sort of person to person. But I would say if you're concerned that, someone may be suicidal or you're looking for signs that's something that they might be thinking about, generally it's kind of sort of maybe even subtle, but changes in that person. Maybe they're more withdrawn. They potentially could be quite extroverted and quite outgoing, and they're kind of sort of less so. They've maybe drawn back from usual kind of sort of support networks like friends and family and colleagues. Again, some people sort of differ generally as kind of sort of a baseline, but it's just subtle changes that you notice are different for that person. Maybe, they're struggling to look after themselves. There may be someone who's sort of, particularly house proud and, cleaning and tidying and having an organized space is part of their norm and part of their, happy place, and that's changed. Another sort of indicator as well, which is also a difficult topic of conversation, but not everyone, but a lot of people who are potentially experiencing suicidal thoughts or feeling suicidal can also often engage in self-harm. And when it comes to self-harm, in most cases, typically there's some kind of sort of physical evidence of that, in terms of inflicting that harm, but it may be just as subtle as, someone who has been feeling low and you always go out for coffee with them every Thursday, and, 1 week they say, oh, I'm not really feeling up to it, but then it happens the next week, and they're not in contact with you as much, and that they're very quiet or they're very subdued. So things like that, changes in a person over quite a short period of time, can indicate that there might be something deeper going on there. And that might lean you towards having a conversation of, first of all, is everything okay? It would it would be sort of prudent to, initially start the conversation with, I care for you. I've noticed that, haven't seen you around lately. Is everything all right? Is there anything I can do? Anything that you want to talk about? And just opening that conversation in that way can lend itself to, having a deeper conversation about how they might be feeling. But certainly sort of, quick changes or changes over a short period of time in terms of how someone is sort of interacting or presenting themselves could be an indication that they're potentially struggling.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. And it sounds like really the signs can be very different depending on the
Very
person.
different.
And I guess
Yeah.
it's important to say as well that all these signs would not necessarily mean that someone is suicidal, or it might
Yeah.
be that someone is suicidal and it's very hard to spot. I'm conscious there might be people listening who've lost someone to suicide, and it may be that there weren't many signs. So I
Yeah.
think what sounds like what you're saying is that just using our relationships with the people around us, noticing what's normal for them if things might have changed. And like you said, the most important thing is just being there and checking in with someone and
Yeah.
opening up the
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're absolutely right. And I think that's a good point that you make there, Kate, in that, I've spoken to a number of people that have sadly lost loved ones to suicide, and they will often say, like, I just wish I knew, I just wish there was
Yeah.
something that I could do. And yes, there will be potentially subtle differences that you might know, but everyone's different. And some people might not know that. But I think the most important thing is sort of communication and talking to people, because by having open conversations like you and I are having, you're more able to find out sort of how, someone's feeling, but everyone is ultimately very different.
Yeah, completely. Okay, so we know that asking someone doesn't make it more likely to happen. You've outlined some of the ways that we might notice that something's not okay with somebody. So how on earth do you start the conversation? Well, you've touched on that actually by just saying like, how are you doing? I haven't seen you around so much in that example. But what do you do if someone says, actually, yeah, I have been thinking about taking my life. I have been thinking about ending things. I think a lot of people worry about, oh, what do I do after that? I've
Mhm.
not got the answers. How do I fix it? How do I stop it from happening? What would your advice be if someone turns to you and says, actually, yeah, I have been feeling suicidal?
Yeah. So my first advice, and I think the most important thing to do in that situation is remain calm. And I know that can be incredibly difficult, if you're speaking to your partner or your friend or a colleague or, even a sibling or a parent, them seeing how they're feeling and it can be really, really challenging to take. But I think the first thing is to kind of sort of remain calm, as well as sort of how you approach that situation when asking that question. Also be sort of mindful of that the other person, by divulging that they're feeling suicidal, they've been having thoughts about suicide, may be quite apprehensive about when they, tell someone that what will happen next. They might be quite worried about that. So try and sort of remain calm. When it comes to having that type of conversation, open it, in terms of positive recognition is always really good. Like, I've recognised that you're not, you haven't been, going, to the gym lately. You love the gym, or I've been noticing that you seem quite sort of, teary. I've noticed a change in you. Is everything okay? Start that dialogue with, is everything okay? Is there anything going on? Again, because everyone's different, people are different. Some people may respond to initial questions differently. You can have people who, depending on the relationship you may have with them, can be very sort of clear within the communication, and can often tell you that they are suicidal without you sort of directly asking them. But with a lot of people, I would say it's probably not like that, and generally the conversation needs to head in a certain direction before they advise that they are feeling suicidal. There's a lot of ways in which people ask someone, if they're suicidal. Are you having thoughts about not wanting to be here anymore? Have things got so bad that, you've thought about ending your life? Can you not go on anymore? And that's fine. I would urge people to use whatever language they feel is comfortable for them and is comfortable for the person that they're talking to. But actually, there's absolutely no harm, based on what we touched about earlier, with just being quite clear and just saying, are you feeling suicidal? Are you having thoughts about wanting to end your own life? And you can, judging on the environment and judging on sort of the conversation prior to that, you can caveat that conversation with, if you feel more comfortable, I'm going to ask you a question and it's quite sensitive, and I'm going to ask you a question. I don't want you to panic. I'm just asking because I care. Are you feeling suicidal? So you can always preface the question with something that makes you and the person you're talking to sort of, a little bit more comfortable. But once you ask that question, if someone says, yes, actually, I am feeling suicidal, I have been having thoughts about suicide, again, sort of remain calm. I think the first thing when you hear that response, it's really important to, and it sounds very basic, but people can sometimes forget about it because they're concentrating on what's being said, is just acknowledge it and acknowledge how difficult it might have been for that person to come out and say, yeah, I am. I'm having
Yeah.
thoughts about suicide. Language like, I really appreciate you telling us that. And that actually must have been really hard to say, I'm here for you. That type of recognition and assurance can go a long way, and it can create that safe space to be able to continue that conversation. So yeah, just creating that safe space, using language that you feel is comfortable, the other person feels is comfortable, and making sure that you acknowledge and assure them that, you're here to listen and don't panic,
Mm.
don't rush for the phone, or, it's just have that conversation. Naturally, I wanted to talk about risk as well after you've had that type of conversation. So, not everyone who is experiencing suicidal thoughts or is feeling suicidal is going to attempt to take their own life imminently, or going to attempt to take their own life, in the near future. There's the suicidal thoughts, and then there's something which is called suicidal intent. So what I would also be doing, if you feel comfortable doing so, and I think everyone should feel comfortable doing so, because this conversation's about looking after people that we love and we care about, is once that person divulges that they are feeling suicidal, And again, using whatever language feels comfortable to you, I would always be asking around, just very sort of quickly, can I just ask, those thoughts that you've been having, have you thought about how you would do something? Like, have you done anything to harm yourself in any way? Like, have you got any plan there? Just because I think it's important to note that someone that's suicidal needs help, they need support, they need advice, they need care, but someone who's shown any kind of signs that there's some form of planning or intent there might need just that bit more urgent help.
That's so practical, that advice. Thank you, Luke. And I love how you've used language and you've given some really great suggestions about how to ask the question, but in ways that feel comfortable to you and to the other person. Because if you're asking someone something that's so personal and difficult, you're not becoming a different person as you do that. You're still you, you've still got the same relationship with that person. So you speak in a way that you normally would with them. That's really practical. And I think you're right, you touched on a couple of times there about the kind of the what happens next.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about the person who's feeling suicidal might be nervous about telling anyone because they worry about what might happen next. But equally, the person who's asking the question might think, right, they've said yes. Now what do I do? And
Yeah.
like, what support is out there for people who are feeling suicidal, and where could we signpost people to? It's worth saying we'll put some resources in the episode notes here for people to find some resources online. But yeah, what about the what next?
Yeah, there's so much support out there in terms of someone who's experiencing suicide, and a lot of the support is kind of sort of tailored to also different groups of people as well. So first of all, we have the Mental Health First Response Service, NHS 111 Option 2, which is now a national model. So anyone that is anywhere within England, 24 hours a day, that may be feeling suicidal can, dial those three numbers, 111, and select option 2. You'll get through to a mental health professional who'll speak to you compassionately, empathetically, and first and foremost, just listen to what's going on. And they can kind of sort of guide you to the most appropriate sort of, level of support. There's a number of other different services as well. So we have Samaritans, which is a nationwide charity that offer more of a kind of sort of a listening and support service in view of people that are struggling. And we also have Calm, the campaign against living miserably. They have a really brilliant sort of helpline for people who are struggling. And then we'll have a couple of other bespoke kind of sort of offers. So we'll have Shout, which is a text-based service, which I think is a fantastic offer in view of the fact that a lot of people, especially just initially, maybe sort of struggling to converse sort of, verbally sort of over the phone. So that's a text-based service that can provide you some sort of form of reassurance, but also anonymity if you feel like you need it at that time. And then we've also got things like Papyrus, which is a hotline dedicated and a helpline that's dedicated to people under the age of 35 who are experiencing that. So they help sort of younger people, and also Andy's Man Club, which is a sort of a club and a resource that's dedicated to men experiencing suicidal thoughts across the country. So there's a lot of resources. Obviously, you have the traditional kind of sort of clinical routes in terms of open up a conversation with your GP, and there's a number of clinical outcomes that NHS 111 option 2 can support with if you make a call to our service. What can also be really useful as well, and we have this type of conversation when someone rings NHS 111 option 2, is sort of when we've had this conversation, we know that someone's feeling suicidal, we know what's going on. If you feel comfortable having that conversation, establishing, how long has this been going on for, and what might have triggered that. Within a lot of teams, similar to NHS 111, we try and look at sort of identified triggers in terms of mental health. Is it a housing issue? Is it a relationship issue? Is it a financial issue? Is it an employment issue? And there's numerous services that can support the individual issues that may lead to mental health crisis and ultimately suicidal thoughts. But there's a whole host of support out there. And even just a quick Google search of, my friend's feeling suicidal, what can I do to help? Google will now often, at the very top of the page, have, when you type in the word suicidal, do you need some help? And it'll come up with, the Samaritans, NHS 111. So there's lots of support out there. Don't panic. There's a lot of amazing services that are dedicated to support people who are feeling like this.
That's amazing. What an incredible list of services and a variety to help people in all kinds of different ways. And I guess that's a really important message for you if you are feeling suicidal, knowing there are people out there dedicated. They're here for that specifically. They'll help you no matter what is causing the issues that you've been experiencing. But also, if you're a person asking someone if they're suicidal and you worry, like, well, what happens next? I don't know how to help. You don't feel like you have to. You can just signpost them on, you can share some of these amazing resources with them. It's not for you to resolve those issues for them. You're just there to listen and to help and be there for them as a person. So thank you. That's been a really practical guide to how to have some of these really most difficult conversations. I really value sharing your expertise, and we'll all the resources that Luke has mentioned and others we will put in the show notes to make sure that you've got them there. But there's some really great advice there. Even just a quick Google, like you say, Luke, all these resources will come up. So thank you so much for joining us today. That's been really helpful.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow, rate and share. See you next time.